Hello, this is Dr. Jean, dear future people. And now, in the last video, we were talking a little bit about science, measuring, and what measuring really means. Today, we are going to talk about something more on the social side. We're going to talk about empire. And many of the things that we're going to say today, we already kind of hinted at in the past videos. So this is going to be a little bit of a summary also. So we discussed that truth domain means that every truth has conditions and circumstances forming a locality in space-time where certain patterns remain relatively constant, and so these relatively constant patterns are going to be regarded as truths, which again are relevant to that specific location. So similar events tend to recur. Facts and relationship may hold more or less because of relative permanence of certain patterns, and because of that, there are certain truths that will hold for a while in a particular location. So if we contrast this with the idea of relevance, then we will see that there is a density of applicability of a function describing the truth domain. So what that means is that in a certain location, certain truths, events, facts tend to be more relevant and other locations less relevant. But this is not all or nothing. This is not black and white. This is not ones and zeros. What that means is that there is a certain density, how much these things are relevant to a particular location, right? So there's really underlying continuity, but there is some quantitative and qualitative differences between this particular location and the next. So when we forcefully, with violence or seduction, or with any kind of forceful means, artificially extend truth domains, meaning that what is true here must be equally and unalterably true everywhere else in space or in time or in both. Well, that particular thing is what we call empire. Okay? So we are going to have an extension which is highly artificial, virtual. Okay? And so what that means is that this extension is going to be maintained by force. And this force may not manifest itself as violence. It could be persuasion, seduction, and deception. In other words, parasitism. So from this, we can immediately see that certain empires disguise themselves. And it looks as if they were not an empire, but following these criteria, they really are. So the final common pathway of extension of truth domain is delegation. So this is going to be extremely important because somebody living in an empire may think that empire was imposed on them artificially from above, but it is maintained not from above because violence, even persuasion, is very expensive. It needs a very high maintenance. So, what the imperial forces need is to convince their subjects to delegate out core functions. And this delegation is going to then maintain the empire, right? So you need cooperation from the subjects. from the peasants, from the pawns, from the underlings, okay? And this delegation will maintain the empire cheaply, okay? So please understand, this is very, very important, that without the active cooperation of the subjects, the empire cannot be maintained from above. So let's talk about delegation a little bit. So in terms of empire, the easiest form of delegation is representation. Okay, so in social organization or in religion, you choose representatives and you accept representatives. And this representation is a form of delegation that will maintain empire. Commercial services. You delegate out your basic chores, your basic functions. Okay, food, drink, mode of transportation, etc. Professional services, okay, such as healthcare, building a dwelling, taking care of children, okay, and recuperation, entertainment and travel. And this is going to be very, very important because with entertainment, you're going to have diversion of your mind activity away from mind cultivation to some kind of switching off your mind, okay? Switching off your mind of important topics that are really relevant to you. So representation, commercial services, professional services, and recuperation, these are the things that you delegate out. And by this delegation, you're going to maintain empire. So delegation and extension of truth domain are the two main components in building an empire. And that is irrespective of the particulars, political, religion, ideology, etc. You see, people in 2023, they somehow think that there are certain political systems that are better than others, that there are certain ideologies that are better than others. Yet we see that extension of truth domain and delegation are practically the same. They just take up different forms, but they are there. An empire built up by military persuasion is easy to recognize. Okay, so the whole thing is that we call empire an empire when we talk about militaristic empires. But empire can be other things as well. It's just that you have to dig a little deeper. You have to understand a little bit more the complexity of how an empire can be held up together other than by military means. So seduction and deception are very important here, and they sometimes are very difficult to recognize. Of course, over-specialization, mass production of commercial and professional services, over-specialization and mass production of information such as news, fashion, opinion. These things promote uniformity, and uniformity always helps empire. Okay, so but notice that uniformity is not natural. Uniformity always forms a bubble, and bubbles sooner or later tend to pop. They explode, right? So empire is always a temporary thing. It's a transient thing. It's not a natural thing. There are empires, okay, and they tend to come back in this form or that form or that form, but they are always transient because empire is a highly artificial entity. So, representation of local interests is defined as a separate interest related to a group. And that separate interest, when it is represented, then we talk about politics. That's what politics means. Politicians are like actors or lawyers. They are hired to represent local interests, separate local interests. So from this, you immediately see that from the point of view of Vitologia, politics is a very, very highly artificial thing that it needs to be transcended, because in Vitologia, separate local groups with separate local interests are to be transcended. But we will talk about that quite a bit later on. So, politics may promote variability at a superficial level. However, fixed separate interests, okay, are always imaginary and they are always highly artificial. So, for example, political classes. Political classes is a mental construct, right? So, political classes are based on the idea that there are separate groups with separate interests, and these separate interests are objective. And obviously, this is not the case, because any group is a category. And there are multiple categories with multiple variables behind them, right? So it's not that we have separate entities, we have separate groups, but it is that we have complex patterns with certain similarities. So politicians, being representatives, they perform professional services and participate in delegation. They are one useful professionals that make delegation possible by representation, for example. But again, politicians are always hired, but sometimes they can be relatively more independent or independent thinking, but they are always representatives that are hired for a purpose. Okay. So the danger of delegation is that whenever you delegate out something, you are pushing that something closer to the person you delegated it to and further away from yourself. For example, if you delegate out raising your child, the child may be more loyal to the person who was actually doing the child raising. Okay, and so therefore, if you delegate out core functions like this, you are going to have problems with loyalty, okay, and integrity, like integrity of a family, for example. So entrusting others, professionals, relatives, to take care of a child, sure, it's necessary, but it comes at a price. The child will be formed to their image with relatively little or less influence by the parent. And that's going to cause problems. So alienation, weakening of a natural bond is going to enhance uniformity. Why? Because anything done professionally tends to be done with less local uniqueness, right? And if you do something with less local uniqueness, then you're going to have relative uniformity. And that's going to be a problem. And this problem is going to help the formation of empires which really feed on uniformity. So what can you do to avoid all of this, or at least lessen the importance of all of this? Well, you have to cultivate the mind. And you have to recognize that delegation will lead to parasitism, exploitation, and alienation, with your uniqueness lost. So I'm not saying here that delegation is always a bad thing, but what I'm saying is that you have to understand that whenever you delegate out something, you are going to go into a bond that may harm the integrity, the identity of you. And so if you cultivate your mind, you understand that, and you are going to develop measures to counteract this. And maybe you will even identify things that need to be delegated out as little as possible because they are core functions and they may harm your identity and your integrity a great deal. So here is the problem. We said that from above, from the highest level, empire is maintained by either military force, violence, or more commonly and more effectively and more cheaply by persuasion, by seduction, by deception. Okay? And so this convinces the subjects, okay, the slaves, to delegate their things out, to use imperial institutions, which they don't even understand that they are imperial because of deception. Okay, and so they delegate out core things and they then contribute to relative uniformity, and they also then give away much of themselves to empire. And so because of this, because of the lack of cultivation of the mind, and because of lesser defense against deception and seduction, we are going to have the slaves, the subjects, the average person, the little man, the most common average people that are responsible for all the horrors of the modern age, because they themselves, with their actions, with their delegation, with their lack of cultivation, with their giving away core functions, with their less integrity and lesser identity, they hold up the texture of the empire that empire is based on. So the ultimate responsibility for all the horrors, wars, famine, pandemia, whatever, always rests with the people. The average person, your friends, your relatives, you. So the most fundamental thing to counteract this is to recognize empire. And so one very easy mark that you can recognize an empire by is centrality. So you have centrality of attention. Remember when we were talking about idolatry, we said that everybody is looking at the same focal point, right? Idolatry, popularity, competition, fame, success. These have a common denominator, and that is centrality. So you always have a false idol. Well, idols are always false. While reality is infinite, continuous, and variable, the idol is a separate and very definite being, an entity around which a centrality is formed, and that centrality defines an empire. So if you understood that the truth domain is always local, then the empire, even the most deceptive one, reveals itself because centrality is going to be unnecessary. So there is a middle way. There are useful similarities. There are meaningful models that can be used by a lot of different people. Okay? So there is teaching, there are wise people, there are councils, there are professional organizations, institutions, and and yes, of course, I mean, to some degree, you have to have guidelines like professional guidelines or laws, rules. Yes, but you always have to understand that all of these things are methodical entities. They are tools to make life easier. And those tools have limited applicability under certain circumstances and much less in other circumstances and other localities. So, truth domains are not absolute and they're not permanent. Centrality and delegation must not substitute for unique cultivation and care of children or mind or anything else. And that takes us to the next level. And we need to understand what an individual is. And we need to understand whether or not an individual needs special talents. Well, do we need extra skill, ability, or talent for organic thought? So, first of all, let's define what talent is. Talent is a special ability for something in an individual, a talented individual. So there is no talent without an individual. And the individual is a unit. So a unit always comes about by ignoring continuity and variation and change. If we don't understand that a community, like life itself, has organic parts that are really not separate, that are really not units. We just approximate them as units. So, for instance, when we have a group, we can say that we have a common ancestor, yes, okay. And that group is relatively separate from another group, yes. So there is a unit called a group. And in that group, there are certain units called individuals, yes. But understand that all of these things are really not separate because they are in deep interaction with things around them. So drives, motivations, inclinations may be denser, stronger, or maybe more apparent in one individual versus the other because of local conditions and conditions that that person inherits from a particular line. But these drives, motivations, inclinations, these special abilities are not separate. They are, and they are not relevant to a separate being. They are just easier to notice here than there. Okay? So the individual is not a separate unit, and talent is not a separate talent. Rather, what is happening is that a unique local expression of group thinking is denser here than there, and it's more noticeable here than there. but it is part of group thinking. It is part of group talent. It's diffuse. It's just answer, so it is easy to see. So do we need extra skill, ability, or talent for organic thought? Well, obviously not, because organic thought is by default. Okay, so you do not need anything extra for organic thought. Anybody and any groups, any societies are by nature able to have organic thinking. So, organic cooperation, organic co-function, organic co-living is natural. And local uniqueness is also natural. And one of the functions of organic cooperation is to co-function with our environment, but yet contribute to it, influence it uniquely. And you maintain your uniqueness by understanding that you do not delegate out your core functions. You could cultivate your mind. You cultivate your mind together with your local uniqueness and you maintain that. So, by cultivating the body and the mind, it's like cultivating a garden. You maintain uniqueness and you contribute uniquely, but nevertheless, by default, you are an organic part so that you cooperate because you are in a vast organism together with everybody else. Variations are never random. They follow complex underlying patterns. So inheritance is very complex and it can be oversimplified, leading to all kinds of very extreme and extremely dangerous ideas. But really, inheritance is complex because inheritance reflects experiences of an entire line, okay, having footprints. They call it epigenetics or whatever, okay, footprints in the genetic material, in the function, the patterns, okay, that appear as tendencies in someone, or they may appear as talent in someone. Variations may be of different density. So in one person, the inclination to paint may be more than in another person. It's present in everybody, but here it's more noticeable than there. It's stronger here than there because of conditions, but also because of conditions embedded, okay, in inheritance patterns. So in terms of individual, and we talked about this again, you have inheritance patterns that are relevant to that individual, but really not only in space, but also in time. The individual is only a density, okay? A density of an entire line, which is high contrast because the oversimplification of a density is a unit. So the oversimplification of a particularity in a line is an individual. And so birth and death, defining an individual in time, okay, or physical contours defining an individual separateness in space, make you feel that there is an individual separate mind, soul, and body, whereas this is only an artifact, okay, by oversimplification. So talents are easy to see densities. Like, for example, this is a great painter. This is a great, I don't know, general, or this is a great scientist. But they are really a manifestation of group thinking, a manifestation of an inheritance pattern. Okay. So death is transcended by talent, and talent also transcends the individual because talent is not assigned to a unit. Talent is there as something that has been forming for some time in a special group under special circumstances. So, for instance, if you go to a place where there are great painting schools, then of course an individual is more likely to be inclined to simply be a part of that tradition, right? But it's not an inherent separate uh, individual talent that determines this, but a whole complex pattern of circumstances, including traditions. So it's not only in space, but also in time. A cultivated mind survives through it being an organic, non-separate part of a continuum, of course. So you may think that you are an individual who is born and will die. No, you're part of a line, not only in time, but also part of a group in space. And so if you transcend your separateness because you shed your oversimplifications, because you cultivate your mind, then you will understand that. Remember this picture? When we said that a drop of water is really not a separate entity. So organic thinking is natural. We already said that. It is by default, but it is also by default that organic thinking needs care. It needs cultivation. It needs high maintenance. And high maintenance guarantees that you have to delegate out less. And if you delegate out less, then you maintain your uniqueness more, and then you serve empire less, right? So once again, we came back to the same issue that we were talking about when we were describing empire. So you don't copy and paste, you don't follow, because if you do that, then you basically enhance uniformity, homogeneity. No, you cultivate your uniqueness. It's like a lighthouse, you know. You become light, and that light will then shine, but it's not like fire, which really makes things uniform. No, light simply exposes heterogeneity because you see heterogeneity more. You see more that this is different from this and this is different from this. Why? Because there is light. And with light, you are able to see differences more. Right? So light is pure energy. There's no space, there's no time if you are pure energy. Because it makes no purpose to imagine a rigid space and a rigid time. It diffuses at high speed, penetrating all. Now, barriers and densities, of course, they exist. But really, they are not barriers and densities. They are really influences that change the light. Okay, they decrease luminosity, yes, but they are not permanent, they are not absolute. Light penetrates all, to more or to less, depending on the density of the material. But the stronger the light, the more it penetrates. And anything that the light goes through changes the light. Right? So there is organic interaction there too. So you see variations and changes, but you do not see grades, and you do not see units, right? You do not see space or a time rigid grid. You see natural variability. So talent is as much real as is the individual with definite birth and death. Birth symbolizes a beginning. It's a symbol. It's an oversimplification. But viewing it from a wide enough perspective, there is continuity and there is no separation. There's nothing sudden. Sure enough, birth is a great event, but any event is only a density in time. It's an easy to observe change. But then somebody with a transcendent organic thought has enough resolution so that sudden abrupt changes are really not all that important because we are able to see even more subtle changes. So it's like a drama in the theater, right? It simplifies things to make a point. So there's an overemphasis, and this overemphasis is useful because it draws attention to a certain point. So it makes very sharp contours. It makes things black and white. It's the same thing is birth. It's a drama, right? But really there is underlying continuity. A picture resolution is the inverse of the observer resolution, okay? But there is really underlying continuity, right? So dots may seem confluent to you, but also dots are always on the basis of underlying continuity because nothing has very sharp and definite contours and borders. And if these things exist, they exist in relation to the observer's resolution, detection capability. Talent is also continuous. So yeah, there are densities of so-called great painters, but they are really a manifestation of a great painting school in a particular locality in time and in space, right? So when you think that, okay, there was this great painter and it's an absolute separate thing, and that great painter is just a miracle. And it is a miracle, but it certainly is not fixed or separate. It came from a painting school, a painting tradition, right? And under certain circumstances and with certain stronger, denser inclinations, something more prominent happened, but it's really part of a line. So symbolism, what does symbolism mean? Linking a general idea to a separate entity, like an allegory, a preeminent example, a prominent example, okay? And this prominence becomes an idol if you simplify things. Separate idol, a focal point. So you have a great person, a great painter, a great general. But they are really not separate miracle entities. So you have inference and predictability. Similar patterns are associated with similar outcomes, okay? That's what risk is. Certain patterns are associated with certain outcomes. So when you're saying, all right, well, this person said something which is right, and then again said something that is right, so it's possible that when this person says something the next time, it will also be right because previously that person has been right, all the time. So that's how you think. So if A child is called to the table. There's a good chance that there's going to be good food, so the child comes. The sun rises the same time and the same date every year in a certain location. The speed of light remains constant in a vacuum. So there are certain things that you can more or less predict. So whatever he says must be right because so far he has always been right. But understand that these things are always relative and relative to the circumstances. And these things might follow a pattern that is relatively common in a location. And so these predictions are based on previous experiences, based on a large number of observed patterns that were similar. And similar things are linked to similar outcomes. Okay? But conditions and circumstances always change in time and in different localities. You may have a gradual change that you do not notice because your resolution is not good enough. You may have unexpected new effects because of a combination of things. You may have different observers observing things differently. So, what is perceived as separate, what constitutes a system, will also change. And so, what you perceive as an individual is not an individual for everybody, for every possible thinker or observer. It's the same thing as 3 plus 3 may equal, 5.8 or 6.0023 in actual life, depending on what is modeled by this mathematical operation. Okay? So it has a certain relevance and truth value. So patterns in everyday life are not fixed, but they are more familiar, so we trust them more. So we trust that birth and death are observed very often, emotions are felt very often, human gestures, language, emotion expression are all very familiar. So prediction based on these seem reasonably certain. And so we trust these predictions. Okay. And so we then, since we trust these emotions, we are going to say that, this is a person, a separate entity, and we assign to that person a special ability. And then we say that person is going to be an expert. That person is going to be a special somebody, a great person, and we attribute authority to that person. So notice that what we call natural phenomena are then grouped together as entities based on what we have experienced with in our everyday life. So we simplify parts of the group as individuals, and we simplify parts of natural gas as gas particles. So we use these kind of metaphors that we are familiar with in everyday human life to model things that are a little bit more difficult to notice or that are a little bit more far away from us. Okay? And then what we call human rules or human laws, we then use to describe non-human things as well. So natural law is really extended from human law. And from human individuals, we extend to particles like atoms, like molecules, like subatomic particles. Okay, but these are all projections, and they are all artificial human things. Yes, a molecule, an atom, they are human things. And if we go very deep, then we understand that this metaphor is good to a certain degree. But then we really understand that in nature, things that are more far away from us, like for example, things at a very, very small scale, really do not behave like humans behave. And even humans, of course, do not behave like we oversimplify them to model their behavior. So what we are seeing here is that from the human perspective, if we take too few factors and too narrow a perspective, then we'll have the idea that the complexity of reality can be reduced to laws and individuals. And then we assign special laws to special individuals, right? And if the actual observation for example, human behavior or behavior of subatomic particles do not follow predictions based on these natural laws, which are really metaphors, then we are going to have a new special law which is going to correct the previous law. And so we are going to make more and more and more and more and more laws to correct things. But really, we never go back and say, maybe our original law was a metaphor, which is, under certain circumstances, seem to be relevant, but in other circumstances, it's not going to be very relevant. So we better make up a new model, for instance, okay, based on review of things. We just correct things by introducing ever new laws, not understanding that all of these laws are just metaphors. Okay, like a human individual, like talent, these are all oversimplifications. Human law is more familiar than natural law, of course, because natural law is an extension of human law. Everyday life basic patterns is what we are more familiar with. And we project out everyday life basic patterns to all kinds of things. So the concept of birth, death, individuals, and talents are kind of written in stone in our minds. Okay? And we then project these things out on other things. And then we deny this extension, these metaphors. And we are going to say that no, molecules and atoms and laws governing them are not human. You see, they were born as metaphors, but we deny them. And then we are going to say that no, they are objective, they exist, which is nothing short of ridiculous. So these concepts may change very slowly, but they do change because humans change. And conditions of humans around humans also change. And if we have a deep organization and a wider perspective rising from deep organization, then these metaphors are seen as what they are. They are simple tools, they are artifacts, mental constructs that are useful. But they are most useful, especially if they're fixed, in a lower level of organization. In a higher level of organization, these models are useful but not needed as much. So mental organization changes how we look at individuals. It changes how we look at authority, idolatry, talent, and empire. And that takes us back to what we started this whole series of lectures with. And that is that mental organization really changes the way we look at reality. And with that, it changes the way we interact with reality or the relationship between mind and reality. And with that, I thank you for your attention and goodbye for now.